aside the issue of whether or not there is a fundamental layer of basic concrete material objects and just focus on the ones with which we are most familiar from everyday life. Artifacts, like tables and chairs, ships and computers. Artifacts, by the way, are human-made objects. So when we say an artifact, that's what we mean. Organisms, human beings, cats, trees, and other medium to large size natural inanimate objects, rocks, mountain planets, and so on. So again, we last week discussed a lot of tricky issues about composition. Just kind of put those aside and just help yourself to the idea that there are such things as tables and chairs and all that. Perhaps you've already heard of the ship of Theseus. Actually, let me check in. Is anyone who's heard of the ship of Theseus? Type in yes if you have, no if you haven't. Well, you're in for a fun ride if you have, and you're in for a fun ride if you haven't. If you have, what you're going to get today is kind of the professional treatment. And if you haven't, then you're going to get exposed from the get-go with the professional treatment, because there's a kind of an urban legend version of it that's circulating. Oh, Nigel, you put that on the shelf. You have a funny joke about the ship. I think when we get to the end of class, remind me, and then we'll kind of unwind and relax by hearing your funny joke. That's terrific. All right, so creative writing jokes. Wow, bringing a lot to the table. So Theseus had a large wooden ship that he sailed from Crete to Athens. After some time, the ship needed repairs as its planks started to rot. Gradually, the Athenians replaced the planks of Theseus's ship with new planks. After many years, all of the wood of the original ship was replaced with new planks. By this time, the ship contained not a single plank of the original wood. But the original planks were not destroyed. Instead, as each was replaced, the original planks were stored and finally used to assemble all of the original planks into the form of the original ship. Soon, two ships stood side by side. So the urban legend doesn't often mention this. The original planks weren't destroyed. They were replaced, they were put on the side, and then they were reassembled into the original ship after all of the new planks were there. Folks who've heard about this before, did you hear this last part? If you've heard about the ship of Theseus, did it discuss this last part? Unless you heard it from me, right? In which case, yeah, that's the version. This is what happens with urban legends or versions that are more popular, right? You often hear about the ship of Theseus. It gets replaced with new planks of wood, and then so we're going to have these interesting questions about, is it in fact the original ship and so on. But what makes it fun also is that all of the original planks, they weren't destroyed. They were all instead of being as each was replaced, the original planks were stored and finally used to assemble all of the original planks into the original form of the ship. So soon, two ships stood side by side. Let's call the original ship of Theseus that arrived in Athens from Crete S1. So we need to talk about these different ships. So ship 1, S1. Without assuming whether or not it is identical to S1, call the ship that resulted from the gradual replacement of the rotten planks with new planks S2. So S2, that's the one with all the brand new planks of wood. And call the ship that was assembled from the old rotten planks S3. So what you have is this picture here. You have S1 on the extreme left. That's the ship coming in. And then you get the new planks with the little dot. Assume those are new planks, right? So those are the shiny one. You can imagine, swing, there's a little sheen to them. And then what you have at the end is S3 and S2. S2 at the bottom, that's the one with all of the new planks. And S3, that's all of the pile of old planks that have been reassembled. And so you have S1, S2, and S3. Commit that to memory because we're going to be going back to those terms. Take a moment to look at that. And that's the situation we're going to be sort of meditating on and circling around throughout the first half of the class. Is that setup clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you've got a question, ask your question. And needless to say, none of this turns on historical matters. Whether or not this is true, like this in fact happened, who cares? That's not the point. Just this thought experiment would be just enough, right? So now we can ask, which of the two ships resting next to each other on the shore of Athens is the original ship of Theseus? We seem to have four options, and I'm just going to zoom out here so you can see them. Option 1 is repaired. Option 2 is the original. Option 3 is both are the original ship, and neither are the original ship. So I want to make sure you see all the options, right? This logically exhausts all the possible combinations. Option 1, repaired, says that only the repaired ship is identical to the original ship. So the ship with the little, all of the planks have little dots. That's the one that's identical to S1. So in other words, S1 is identical to S2, but S1 is not identical to S3. That's option 1. Option 2, only the ship with the original planks is identical to the original ship. So the one at the top here on the extreme right, the one at the top, S3, right? So in other words, S1, excuse me, Oy. S1 is identical to S3, but S1 is not identical to S2. Another possibility, and again, without thinking here, no one's argued for any of these positions. We just want to canvass all the possibilities. It's one, it's the other, it's both, it's neither. And both, you can say both ships are identical to the original ship. In other words, S1 is identical to S2, and S1 is identical to 3. So the two ones that are on the shore at the extreme right, those are all identical to S1, the original one. And then neither, you can say neither ship is identical to the original ship. So S1 is not identical to S2, and S1 is not identical to S3. That's just the logical possibilities. Again, just a moment's reflection would allow you to sort of exhaust all of those combinations. It's like if I say, do you want salt or pepper, salt and pepper? I can say, I want salt alone, I want pepper alone, I want both, I want neither. That's 4 possibilities logically from the combinations. That's all we have right now. Those are going to be the options we're going to be exploring. Are those clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you got a question, ask your question. And again, I like this method of approaching things. I feel like this is exemplary of what good metaphysical work should look like. Just kind of like you don't prejudge any of these possibilities that from the get-go. You lay them out, and then you turn around, and of course, now we're going to think about what are the reasons for and against, right? So we will look at arguments for and against each option. But first, let us explain the identity sign here. When this symbol is used to make a metaphysical claim, it reads as is identical to. In mathematics, one uses the same symbol to express equalities, such as 3 plus 2 equals 5. However, in metaphysics, the sign like this is the sign of identity. It refers to the metaphysical relation of numerical identity. So remember numerical identity, right, as opposed to qualitative identity. Because we'll agree when we're discussing this, like someone makes the claim that S1 is identical to S2, we can all agree if you look at S1 and you look at S2 that they're not qualitatively identical. Because if you look at the planks on S2, they're all that little dot, they're all brand new, and the planks on S1 are all rotten. So we're not dealing with qualitative identity. What we're concerned with is numerical identity. It's the same thing, right? So this is an important distinction that we looked at before. Does everyone remember that distinction between qualitative identity and numerical identity? Type in yes if you do, no if you don't. Cool. And so would it not be like thisness and suchness? Yeah. So suchness, right? So we can agree that, let's say, in this case, S3 and S1 share the same suchness, right? But they can be numerically distinct. So you can have, like, for instance, when you have identical twins, they share the same suchness, but they have different thisness. It's this twin and that twin. So yeah, it's somewhere in the vicinity of that around. Remember? Yeah. Does that make sense? They're not numerically identical twins. If identical twins would be numerically identical, how many kids would you have? If you say you say I just had identical twins, and it turns out they're numerically identical, how many kids have you actually had? You just give birth? Yeah, you actually have one. Right? So that's what we mean by numerical identity. It collapses back into one, right? And so that's what we're interested in with this equal sign. Metaphysical relation of numerical identity. So when we say that A is identical to B, and that's how we're going to read that, so don't say equal, we express the claim that A and B are the same entity. As for example, Bruce Wayne is identical to Batman. Yeah. And again, we'll canvas all of that, Michael. So the 3 tokens, right? We'll see in a moment how that's going to compel us to at least, we know if there's 2 tokens, they can't be numerically identical. So that's going to do some lifting for us, Michael. You're absolutely right. Like if we know that we get multiple tokens and we can count them, clearly they're not numerically identical. So yeah. And what is it? What's from Frege? The token stuff, the numerical identity stuff. Jaden, can you just refine that? Just as a point of historical. I mean, the identity relation predates Frege for sure. But if the Bruce Wayne and Batman definitely wasn't from Frege, but the identity relation is explored by Gottlob Frege when he talks about sense and reference. Yeah, so the evening star and the morning star are both Venus, right? So he does some work with that. And in terms of logical notation, if you do formal logic and you take it at least at the intermediate level with me, at one point we learn how to work this into a system of logic. But yeah, so this predates, but it predates Frege. And for what it's worth, the use of the equal sign here for identity relations, if I'm not mistaken, probably goes back to Boole. A lot of this stuff goes back to Boole, if you want to do some history of logic. All right, so let's return to the case of the ship of Theseus. The first answer to our question, which ship is identical to the original ship, is that only S2, the ship that resulted from the gradual replacement of parts, is identical. So the option here, right? Only S2 is identical to S1. And by the way, if I say S1 is identical to S2, it goes both ways, right? I could have just as well said S2 is identical to S1. It's a symmetrical relation. So for instance, if I agree that Batman is identical to Bruce Wayne, Bruce Wayne is identical to Batman, it also goes the other way around. Batman is identical to Bruce Wayne. So nothing much turns on which order in which this is presented, right? So the first option is to say only S2, the one that was made of all of the new planks, is the one that's identical to the previous one. Now here are some thoughts that motivate this answer. First, think about what happens after the first plank on the original ship has become rotten and gets replaced. Call the resulting ship, which is just like the original ship, except for the replacement of one plank, S1 star. Surely we want to say that S1 star is identical to S1, that it's the same as the original ship. After all, the only difference between S1 and S1 star is one plank. Surely S1 can undergo a small repair and maintain its identity. If you've ever owned a car, you probably at some point had to replace a tire or a fender. One doesn't usually think that making such a repair causes your car to cease to exist and a new numerically distinct car to suddenly appear. Rather, we usually think the car after the repair is identical to the car before the repair. It's the same car. It just has a new part. And when I say it's the same car, it just has a new part, it's not quite the same because I've just added a new part. So it's not going to be qualitatively identical, but it's the same cars and it's the same damn car in your driveway. You don't spontaneously own two cars or stop owning one and start owning a new one. It's the same car in a numerically distinct sense. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear, the sort of rationale for the position. If that's clear, type in clear. If you got a question, ask your question. We just go, you take one plank, you switch it, it's like it's improved. It's the same damn boat. Okay, so fair enough. And so once we grant this, we can imagine a succession of ships. S1 star with one new plank, S1 star star with two new planks, right? S1 star 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 and so on, where each ship in the sequence differs from the one before by only one plank. Brand new plank, a brand new plank, and so on. And just as we may say over time, as you make small repairs to your car, it doesn't cease to be your car, but maintains its identity over time. So we can say that Theseus's ship doesn't cease to be Theseus's ship as small repairs are made to it, but rather that it maintains its identity over time. We can thus conclude of the sequence leading from S1 to S2, the ship that results from the final small repair, well, it's one more plank, and yes, the rot's removed, the brand new one comes in, that the identity relation holds at each step. So S1 is identical to S1 prime, S1 prime is identical to S1, or star star, star star star, and so on, all the way to S2, which was the one over here. S2 was the one with all of the planks. And remember, we're looking at this position, the idea that S1 is identical to S2. And note that the identity relation is transitive. A moment ago, I mentioned how it was symmetrical. So, Batman is Bruce Wayne and Bruce Wayne is Batman. You can swap it, but also it's transitive. In other words, for all X and for all Y and for all Z, if you have a relationship where X is identical to Y, and you also have it the case that Y is identical to Z, then it's going to mean that X is identical to Z. Right? So, for instance, if Batman is identical to Bruce Wayne and Bruce Wayne is identical to, the man who lives in Wayne Manor, then Batman is identical to the man who lives in Wayne Manor. So from here, it's just a short step to get us from the claim S1 is identical to S2. So since all of these things are transitive, that's how we get to connect the two bookends of this. And this is an argument for the first position here, that only the repaired ship is identical to the original ship. And again, I am trying to make this as clear as possible, and I think the book is also really clear. Is everyone following along? Is everything step by step clear? If that's clear, type in clear. Let me check in with you. If you got a question, ask your question. And again, it's a strong argument because there's nothing wonky so far, right? Now, this defense is compelling, but there's also a reason to say that the original ship is identical to the ship built of the original materials. So remember, there's another. So we've just made I think, a pretty good argument for why you'd go for option one, that only the repaired ship is identical to the original ship. But you might also say, no, let's go for option two. Only the ship with the original planks is identical to the original ship. So let's go and see what would be an argument for that. Right. The simple reason is that S1, the original ship that came into the harbor, and S3, the one with all of the rot, are made of the same constituents. Not just qualitatively similar constituents, planks that look the same, but also numerically identical constituents, the very same planks. If we adopt a plausible-looking principle that says same constituents, same objects, and it seems to me like a really damn good argument, right? Then we will be forced to say that S1 is identical to S3. It turns out that it's S3 that's identical to S1. And so if you think about it, the planks here, the rotten planks at S3, they're the same. And when I mean the same, not just qualitatively they look like, they really are numerically, each one, they're the damn, they're S1. And so you might say, if you ask, where's the ship of Theseus now? Well, the answer would be S3. And that would be an argument for why you think this position is the correct one. Is that argument clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you've got a question, ask your question. Again, we want to proceed step by step. I don't think we just want to map out what we have to say, right? And given that there's something to be said both in favor of the claim that S1 is identical to S2 and that S1 is identical to S3, I mean, if you think about it, we just gave really good reasons for why you might want to say the correct answer is S2 is identical. And we've also given you good reasons to think S3. Well, then, you combine those, and that looks like a great reason to think that both ships are identical to the original ship. And it looks like option 3 is winning out, right? So given that there's something to be said both in favor of the claim that S1 is identical to S2 with the brand new ship, brand new planks, and also good reasons to think that it's identical to the ones with the rotten planks, then one might think that perhaps option 3 is the best response to the puzzle of the ship of Theseus. There's a good motivation for thinking that S1 and S2 are identical due to the continuity one finds through the gradual transition from S1 and S2, which is just tantamount to a changing of parts, which just amounts to a changing of parts. There's also a good motivation for thinking that S1 and S3 are identical since they're composed of identical parts. They thus conclude that both identity statements are true. However, this claim is problematic. Indeed, it's probably the most problematic of the 4 options. The reason is that, as we've noted, identity is an equivalence relation. And this means that if S1 is identical to S2, and if S1 is identical to S3, then by the symmetry of transitivity of identity that we saw a moment ago, then S2 would have to be numerically identical. Remember, that's what we mean by this. Numerically identical to S3. I mean, here's the argument, right? So let's say you've justified this initial assumption that with using the earlier argument. And you've also done this. All right, fair enough. And then, well, you can use the symmetry of identity to say that S2 and S1 are identical. And then that also leads to the conclusion that S2 and S3 are identical. That's a valid argument. So the conclusion to that argument, that the argument draws, follows logically from the assumptions that it begins with. However, contrary to the conclusion reached, S2 is not identical to S3. Remember what it would mean to say that S2 is identical to S3. This would be to say that there are not two ships, S2 and S3, but just one. That's what we were talking about earlier when I said if you have numerically identical twins, in fact, you don't have twins. But of course, S2 and S3 are distinct ships. And this goes back to Michael's point about the distinct tokens. I mean, when we look here, how can we end up with this weird conclusion, right, that S3 and S2 are numerically identical? They're standing next to each other, right? And this goes back to the point that Michael, is that what you were starting to have in mind when you were circling around that? Yeah, there you go. So see, as promised, that does end up doing some lifting for us, right? And so look, of course, S2 are distinct ships. They're sitting at different locations. They're made of different materials. Therefore, there's not just one ship there, but two. And so if the starting assumptions must be rejected, then that means we cannot accept option 3. So option 3, I think we can say that's not working out. Let me pause here. Is everyone clear on what just happened here? Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things about sameness and difference and numerical identity, you can see some overlap there. Yeah. So the idea is option 3, not going to work, right? So remember the options, just so we're clear again, right? The repaired ship is identical to the original one. The one with the original planks is identical. Both, neither. And I probably, just to not beg the question, to assume I'm trying to prove, I'm going to call this option rotten, right? And then Michael asked, would 1 and 1 be numerically identical? Are you talking about the ships or the abstract entity now? To ship 1 or just the number 1 in the sense that we looked at when we did abstract entities, Michael? Yeah, it'd have to be numerically identical. Yeah, you couldn't have, like, if you went to Plato's heaven and you thought you descended high enough and you saw 2 token instances in Plato's heaven of 1, that means you haven't climbed high enough. You'd have to keep climbing till all you see is the type, and it would only have to be 1. Does that make any sense, Michael? Like, that would just be an indication you haven't climbed high enough to go, like you haven't reached the sun yet. Yep, that's which is strange. And by the way, you couldn't do any work with that mathematically. Just as an aside for anyone, if you're following that particular observation, if what is required for you to really grasp the object, the abstract entity 1, is that really, it has to be, you can't get multiples of it because otherwise you'd have this weird numerical identity, problem. You couldn't use it twice. It's not clear you could calculate with anything like the Platonic forms. That's actually a good potential paper if you're able to make sense of what I just said. All right, so here we are. Where were we? And so there you go. So we just ruled out option 3. Hey, that's progress in philosophy, by the way. Huh? If you can rule stuff out, that's great. I'm going to make a little aside now, though, and talk about the indiscernibility of identicals. Now, there's an important metaphysical principle that is tacitly being appealed to in this last point that we just looked at. This is the principle of Leibniz's law, also known as the indiscernibility of the identicals. Leibniz's law, named after the German philosopher and mathematician, says that if there is something that has a property that something else lacks, then these things are not identical. I should put this in italics because it kind of serves as a definition. If there is something that has a property that something else lacks, then these things are not identical. If they were the same thing, then they would have shared all of the same properties. The very same thing cannot both have and lack a property, since this would be a contradiction. Like, you can imagine, I have long hair and short hair. That doesn't work out. Like, I can't be bald and, lush-headed at the same time. I can be bald and lush-headed at different moments in time, and this is what we're looking at today with persistence, right? As you evolve through time, things can change, and then you want to ask yourself, is it the same thing or a different thing? And that's what we're meditating on with the ship of Theseus. But I can't both have long hair and short hair, right? And more precisely, you can have like we may state Leibniz's law either in either of the following two ways, using the resources of second order predicate logic. And by the way, second order predicate logic only means that we're going to be quantifying over predicates. So you notice here we have for all x, for all y, but we also have for all f. That's a predicate, right? So we can quantify over predicates as well. If you start doing that, that's called second order predicate logic. So for all x, for all y, and for all predicate f, if x is f and y is not f, then you can safely conclude that the two aren't identical. So if an object has a property that another object lacks, then those objects cannot be numerically identical. It can't be one and the same thing. That's Leibniz's law. You can also formulate it in this manner. For all x, for all y, so for a bunch of things, whatever you pick, and a bunch of other things, something else that you pick, and for any predicate, anything you might truthfully say of them, if they are identical, if x is numerically identical to y, it turns out they're like numerically identical twin, they're one and the same, then if you find it true of x that it is f, then it ought to be true of y that it is f, and vice versa. Notice this is a biconditional or equivalence relation. So if it's true of y that it is f, then it should be true of x that it is f. So suppose if Batman has cancer, who else has cancer? You discover that Batman has cancer. Who do you thereby know, given the identity between the two? Yeah, you thereby discover that Bruce Wayne has cancer, right? Because Bruce Wayne and Batman are identical. Bruce Wayne's the x, Batman's the y. And if they really are numerically identical, then it's like if it's true of one that they have cancer, then it's true of the other that they have cancer, right? And that's, I think, like it's pretty strong principle. And that's why pretty much everyone in metaphysics agrees with that. Are those principles, is that clear? Is this little, I put in English and in the logic stuff. Is that clear, everyone? Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. Yeah. And so we've been and we're going to do some work with Leibniz's law, right? If something that has a property, if something has a property something else lacks, then these things are not identical. And metaphysical principles like Leibniz's law are often taken to express facts not just about what contingently happens, but rather necessary truths about what things must be like no matter how the world happens to pan out. So whether or not Batman / Bruce Wayne has cancer, if he does, then both have to. And if he doesn't, then both don't, right? It's not about what's out there in the world, what are the facts. It's about what's necessary. If we're going to say truthfully something about one, we have to say it about the other. And if not, not, right? So this is only tracking necessary logical truth. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything super informative about the world, but it does seem to be one of those rules that the world has to abide by. And by the way, if you were doing early modern philosophy with me, which I haven't taught in years, but I love teaching, we build universes together using Leibniz's law. So we'd see how even God would be compelled to have that constraint, and then we could build up a coherent universe of that using his monadology and all those principles. I don't think you'll ever see Leibniz taught in the manner that I teach it. It's really, really fun. All right, so let's figure out which option is best. So remember, we said that option 3, that both are identical, is S2 and S3. We put that aside, right? So applying Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals to the case at hand, we may be sure that S2 is not identical to S3 because S2 and S3 differ with respect to many properties, such as their material, their location, and so on. I mean, the location would do it, right? That would be just enough. Even if the materials were, qualitatively identical, just the fact that there are different locations at the same time, one and done, right? You apply Leibniz's law and they can't possibly be identical. And since they have different properties, they're not identical. Now, one might try another move, and noting that neither S2 nor S3 has a better claim to being the original ship, you could also say that both S2 and S3 are new ships. Right? This is another possibility. It's option 4, which says that neither ship is identical to the original ship. Here we may allow that there are important similarities between the ship that originally arrived in Athens and the ship that exists now. But say that, strictly speaking, the original ship no longer exists. It's been replaced by 2 new ships. That will be the position of option 4. Neither. So we had, it was the new planks, rotten planks, both, and now we're looking at neither. This last option is appealing because it doesn't force us to choose between S2 and S3 to say which has a better claim of being S1. And it presents us with a more plausible option than option 3, which required us to say that what appeared to be 2 ships sitting next to each other was really just 1 ship, which obviously we want to rule out. However, there's still something unsatisfying about this last option because it forces us to deny that either ship is the original ship of Theseus now. So we're forced to say that the ship of Theseus has now ceased to exist. And notice the trade-off, right? We don't have to choose between S2 and S3, but the price to pay is to say that S1 vanished. Is that clear? Is option 4 clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you've got a question, ask your question. Notice the prices here. There's trade-offs. And by the way, I'm sitting back and imagining myself listening to this for the first time, and I'm having a hard time thinking how this could be clearer. I feel like this is I love this textbook, and this is at its best right now. Like, I feel like even more than arguably maybe the ontology chapters or whatever, I feel like this is as clear a presentation as you can get of anything. I like how it's taking its time. I feel it's extremely satisfying to really, and I'm slowing it down even more, right, by spacing it out and checking in with you and giving examples. I love this approach to metaphysics, right? Yeah. So Kelly says it's easier to read and follow than the textbook. Yeah, and so this is, I'm glad because I'm trying to add something, obviously, right? It's like when we take our time and I trim the fat and I sort of slow down and I check in with you and I give you examples. I mean, that's the idea, right? So the ship's good to begin with, but I'm trying to make it even better. And so I'd love to co-author. I mean, the thing is, I'd love to co-author this book, with the author and make it even more accessible. But part of it is just you have to read it out. You have to do it step by step. All right, so what's more, note that the whole trouble here for S2 having a claim to being the ship of Theseus is caused by the assembly of S3. If nobody had collected the original rotten planks and assembled S3, then there would be no threat to claiming that option 2, as I believe that's option 1, S2 is identical to S1. But how could facts about the identity of S2 be affected by a process happening somewhere else? I mean, this is a really clever worry. I mean, let's go back to the drawing here for just 1 second. Like, we had really good arguments for thinking that S2 is identical to S1. All right, cool. Brand new planks on S2. That's identical to S1. This was the argument where we went plank by plank and we always shrugged our shoulders and said, surely it's the same. And then we remove 1 plank and surely it's the same. It's like when you clip your nail, it's this, like Alexander, Nigel, you clip your nail tonight, you're still yourself, right? So it's surely okay. And then we go on like this and we end up by the transitivity of identity to say that S2 is identical to S1. The only reason why we can't just decide to say, there you go, it's option 1 that wins, is because we also had a good argument for saying option 2. And that then compelled us to say neither, because both wasn't working. So we went back to option 4. But then that means that had they just left the pile of rotten wood into a pile and never reassembled it, or better still, burned it into a bonfire, a very stinky bonfire, then we wouldn't have any problem. We would opt for option 1. And that's extremely strange. That just because someone took it upon themselves to do the poor man's version of the ship, right? So someone's working in the junkyard, and every time the Athenians throw out an old plank, they pick it up, and maybe they're, either they're poor or there's some aficionado, and for historical reasons want to reassemble the original ship, maybe place it in a museum or something, right? Just because they did that on the side, outside of the walls of the shipyard, then all of a sudden we find ourselves being unable to endorse option 1. Can everyone see this objection to option 4? That it would turn on the production of this additional ship, and that's strange? Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. Like if I gave the urban legend version of it, right? Which, as we saw at the beginning, sometimes no one ever mentions that the ship is rebuilt, the old planks are reassembled. Then you'd be like, you can make the argument for S2 and then dust yourself off and say that's conclusive, right? And so that's why this is just like, that's a little strange. Why would that be, right? Let me get back to where I was. Right? How could facts about the identity of S2 be affected by a process happening somewhere else? It's like, imagine I cut my hair and truths about you metaphysically change, right? It's like Garrett's sitting at home and there are true things we can say about Garrett metaphysically, and I shave my head in the comfort of my own home, and all of a sudden there are different truths about Garrett metaphysically. It seems a little weird, right? And so this is why the ship of Theseus presents a puzzle to metaphysicians. One has to choose between options 1, 2, and 4, because we ruled out 3. Does one want to bite the bullet and accept that the ship of Theseus no longer exists today, and there are only 2 new ships, S2 and S3, but at the cost of saying that S1 vanished? Or is there some other way to undermine the motivation we've presented for saying that either S2 or S3 is a good candidate for the ship of Theseus? What's your preferred solution to this? 1, 2, or 4? But again, don't tell me give yourself a couple decades to think about it. But I think we've reached the time for a cool video. I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to paste this in the chat. And I'm going to put things on pause after. And you're all going to say yes once the tab is opened without looking at it. Don't start the video just yet. Type in yes once your tab is opened or a separate window. Make sure everyone opens that up. That's our first cool video. Remember I said we would make a little pause? Everyone, make sure you click on that. That's a YouTube video. You should see this, and you're going to have a fun time with that. I'm going to put the whole class on pause till you come back from that video. When you're back, please type in back. Okay? So go ahead, have fun, relax, and enjoy that clip. I took the liberty of watching it when you were watching it as well. I got goosebumps. How about you? How was that? I promised that we would have some fun and do a little break. How was that? Oh, this is from one of the rare Marvel things that is good these days. This was from WandaVision, and I remember I watched it on TV, but a student when I was teaching this pointed it out to me. I didn't sort of realize that they had this passage where they talk about the ship of Theseus, and then I thought to myself, oh, for future iterations of the course, I'm going to have to work this in. So that's it. So that's the ship of Theseus in a nutshell. Those of you who didn't know nothing about this beforehand, and even those who did, how was this first half of the class? Now I said we'd look at 2 problems. How was this? Are you clearer now than you were, or was this puzzling? Where are you at? It should be puzzling. That's the point, right? Where are you at? How was this first half before we move on to our second half? Interesting and puzzling. Agreed. Like it should pull in at least in as many directions as you should have at least there some pull, right? That you can see the reasons for, right? Cool, puzzling. Cool. All right. So and so one of the things you might wonder though, and I'll let Kelly finish. One of my favorite things we've covered so far. Oh, cool. Well, one of the things you might wonder is like what's the relevance of this outside of this thought experiment, right? Because historically, I doubt whether, in fact, there was ever the ship of Theseus, although you can trust the Greeks to say the truth. Typically, I mean, it bleeds into mythology when you get to things like the Homeric, epics. But, you might wonder, like, what's at stake here? We're going to continue our reading. And sometimes, you have no idea how relevant this stuff could be. Here's one way in which this is relevant. This metaphysical issues surrounding persistence are these metaphysical issues surrounding persistence are vital. I mean, are you numerically the same individual as the 7-year-old version of yourself? Given Leibniz's law, how could a thing with the predicate is young survive to become so different that it must now negate that predicate and with is not young, or go from cannot speak English to can speak English. If you think about it, you yourself are, I hope this is going to hit home. You yourself are the ship of Theseus. Right? I talked about cutting my hair. I mean, you might think that's trivial, but like in an important sense, there are things about me that separate me from my 7-year-old version of myself. And I've just picked 7 years old for no particular reason. And likewise for you. And you want to credit yourself with being the same thing that persisted in time. But what exactly lets you do that? Now, for Aristotle, who we encountered a little bit when we were talking about abstract entities, there must be something that survives through change. Otherwise, we will have a full destruction of one object and the full coming into being of another, rather than the persistence of one continuous object through a change. Although I have to say, my partner today was showing me a picture of our kids just like 2 years ago, and I feel like they're gone. This is actually super relevant to what we're doing. They're younger. There are things about them. They're captured on camera, smartphone camera. And I'm like, those kids are gone. It says, the option that says, well, how can S1 cease to exist? I often get that feeling about my kids when they grow up. I'm like, the younger versions of them, they really do cease to exist. And as a parent, you have to mourn that. It's really, really freaky. So even as just a regular human going about my personal life, I have to kind of grapple with issues of metaphysics. It does seem like S1 at any rate vanishes out of existence. But for Aristotle, and I think it seems sensible to say that there must be something that survives through the change. Otherwise, we'll have the full destruction. When you think about it, full destruction of one object and the full coming into being of another. I don't want to say that I lost my kids, that they got fully destroyed, right? Rather than the persistence of one continuous object through a change. So to explain how there could be continuity through a change, Aristotle proposed the view that substances are complex and consist of two parts. And when he says substances here, he means it in his own manner, whether these are called Aristotelian substances. It's not what we call chemical substances. So substance is the technical name for a thing. But we would now, the closest analogous thing to an Aristotelian substance would be a thing. So things are complex. That is, they've got, let's say, two parts in the manner that we talked about with composition, and they consist of matter and form. For example, in the case of a person, the matter is the flesh and bones, and the form is man or woman. And in fact, even the flesh and the bones has a form. You might want to say that the matter is literally just like stuff, like the carbon in the water, and even flesh and bones is a form itself, right? So when you want to 3D print a bone with sort of cloning or whatever, right, there's a certain shape you give the carbon and so on. In the case of the Eiffel Tower, the matter is iron, and the form is that of a tower. This was the core of Aristotle's physics, his theory of the makeup of objects in nature, now called hylomorphism, from the Greek hyle. Actually, we say hylomorphism because it's a Y, but I believe in Greek it's called hyle, and for matter, and morphe for form. And so you can use this to try to make sense of things, right? You can say where there is persistence through a change rather than destruction of an object, we have continuity of matter through a change in form. So you can use this distinction that hylomorphism presents you with, and hylomorphism now is an ism because it becomes a position in metaphysics for us. Straddling physics, right? So this is present in his physics, but his physics does the sort of work that we would now associate with metaphysics. Let me pause there, and I think this is sort of fairly intuitive, and we'll look at the statue in the clay in a moment to illustrate that. But as this rough sketch of hylomorphism and the distinction between form and matter in Aristotle, is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you've got a question, ask your question. And hylomorphic theory remains an almost unseen part of the way we think about material objects. Still, we need more tools to take into account the fact that ordinary material objects are at least sometimes able to persist through the changes, not just in their form, but in their matter as well. This was the case with the ship of Theseus. So remember, with the ship of Theseus, at least with respect to S2, S2, the ship of Theseus version S2, right? The matter was changed. And to cite another example, scientists tell us that after approximately 7 to 10 years, a human body replaces all of its cells. So this is a big deal, right? And so every 7 to 10 years, there's not a single cell in your body that was present in your former self. Hence, human beings seem able to survive through changes, even when their underlying matter fails to provide any continuity to explain this persistence. And actually, I'm not going to go into philosophy of biology and really delve into this, but it's a really big deal as far as I'm concerned. I do a lot of, this does a lot of lifting in my own philosophical work for other things. But this is kind of a troubling thing. I believe your liver in particular changes itself fairly often. I'm not a biologist, but the cells of your liver are changing. Remember, it produces this acid that helps you break down foods that you digest. And I think it's a very volatile organ and environment to be in. Anyways, I remember faintly that it replaces itself. But at any rate, even if the 7 to 10 years isn't quite right in virtue of the biology, certainly we can say there's not a single cell in your body that's the same as when you were 7 years old. How do we feel about this? That's why I took a young enough version when I said several-year-old version of yourself. Isn't that a bit mind-blowing to think about? I mean, let's touch base for just a brief moment before going on. Like, that's like, when I say my son's, like, I look at pictures of myself and there's not a single cell in common, not a plank in the ship, not a single one. Yeah. It does seem scary. It's freaky. I mean, it's kind of a, and so what we have though is what sort of, okay, so this is that whole thing we're going to look into. Like, what's the continuity here? If you're the same person, what metaphysically justifies the sameness? I can't believe I'm teaching this stuff. I think it's remarkably cool. Like, man, and notice that this discoveries in biology won't alter the fact that these are facts that we need to contend with, right? There's and so yeah. So we will look at rival metaphysical theories that attempt to explain in what persistence consists. As we will see, one central point of disagreement between these views is whether, in order for objects to persist over time, there must be something that exists continuously through the change, as Aristotle assumed in his matter-form distinction. So to help us focus, let's consider this example. A sculptor takes a lump of clay, call it lump, and makes a statue of the warrior Goliath. Call that Goliath. So here you go. You have lump and you have Goliath on a timeline. Suppose that at noon, there's only the lump of clay, but at midnight, the statue of Goliath is finished and placed on a pedestal. So you see here, noon on the left, and at midnight, it's done, and it's Goliath. And let's assume that he's going to bake the clay so that it's going to be nice and hard. At midnight, should we say there are two objects on this pedestal or only one? It might strike you at first as obvious that there's only one object there. But if this is correct, then this means that lump is identical to Goliath. And, well, it seems it cannot be right, since using Leibniz's law and the fact that lump has several properties that Goliath lacks, we can deduce that lump is not identical to Goliath. For example, lump has the property of existing at noon. Goliath lacks this property. Goliath can poke something with his sharp spear, but lump cannot poke anything. Lump and Goliath differ as well in what could happen to these objects if certain conditions were to obtain. While lump has the property of being able to survive being squashed and rolled into a ball, the statue of Goliath lacks this. And I had worked all of this would fit neatly on one page. So now I did a few changes and it kind of didn't do that. I'll fix that later. But the idea is that's the image, right? And so they're different. Definitely there's things that can be truthfully said of lump that cannot be truthfully said of Goliath and vice versa. Is that clear, everyone? And I'll get to your question, Emran, just in 1 second. Yes, Emran asked, could we not use the bread and burger concept with this? You mean like composition? Well, how so? Because it seems to me like that would be trying to solve one mystery with something even more mysterious. Unless you had solved the burger problem, which I don't think, we have a real solution outside of just stipulation, right? Amran, what do you have in mind? How could we use the bread and burger stuff, the composition, the part and whole stuff to fix this? Form matter, right? Without the lump of clay, Goliath doesn't exist. That's true. That's true. But I don't think the part-whole relation is what you need. Like, we just learned about the form-matter distinction. Amran, can you see that would be probably more useful for making sense of that? Form and matter, not part-whole. You might want to say that Goliath owes its matter to lump, even if they changed form. Yeah. So can, like everybody else, can you see that? You might say that it's true. Goliath, had lump not exist, Goliath wouldn't be around. And there's a persistence of matter because it's made of the same clay, right? But it changed form. Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. The form matter distinction does a probably better work for you than the part whole distinction, which is why we front loaded that, right? Actually, I'm going to just shrink this image just a bit. Again, I'm cleaning these things up as I go, just because I want these to all fit. All right. So anyways, I'll fix this after, because then I'm ending up with this huge page. All right. So let's look at some positions on this. I'm going to introduce some new isms here. This is one of the positions that we're going to look at, right? Typically, when we think about persistence, we suppose that there is one object that is present both before and after the change. For example, consider lump. We may assume that there is a certain time at which lump came into existence. Call this time T0. As time passes, lump, that very same object, continues to exist. Perhaps at some later time, T1, lump is rolled into a ball. So you see here T0 at the bottom, T1 is rolled into a ball. And then at some point of time after that, T2, it gets squashed into the shape of a disc, and so on. And finally, our sculptor shapes it into a statue of the mythical warrior Goliath. And so the same object, lump, that exists at each time from T0 to T3 onward is shown below, right? And you notice here, we've got the relation of identity between the two. So you say lump at T0 is identical to lump at T1, is identical to lump at T2, is identical to lump at T3, and we're still going to call it lump because it's the same thing. It just changed form, and it's identical to, and by the transitivity of identity, we can say that the lump at time T0 is identical to lump at T whatever, right? This would be T5 at the end of this series here. And this view here, if you have this view of what's going on, this is what's called endurantism. This is the view that objects like lump persist by surviving from one instant to the next, where what survival comes to is strict numerical identity. Right? Endurantism. Let me just underline this. The view that objects like lump persist by surviving from one instant to the next, where what survival comes to is strict numerical identity. Lump persists from T0 to T3 by existing at each time along the way from T0 to T3, so that the object lump that exists at T0 is numerically identical to that which exists at time T3. And so we'll agree that the word persists here is a neutral term to refer to what the rival theories are trying to explain. Well, if persists is a neutral term, right, then we will say that the object endures when it persists in the way that the endurantist thinks of persistence. So persistence is the name for the problem. Endurance is the name from one view on the problem, namely that it's the view that some object has to survive from one instant to the next, and we'll say that it endures. And all that view is called endurantism. Take a moment to look at the drawing and meditate on it. Type it clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. Endurantism. And this is what you would get if you had the form-matter distinction. So if we did use that resource of the form-matter distinction, we'd say that the matter endured. Right? You might want to say the form changed, but the matter endured, and endured for us is going to be a quasi-technical term. This is just going to be the name of sorting out without assuming a particular question, view or conclusion on it. That'll be the issue, right? The issue of persistence. Kind of like when we talked about the issue of composition, we weren't necessarily assuming that objects do compose, right? Amran is typing. I'll see what Amran has to say, and then we'll move on. So this is similar to the ship S1. Exactly, spot on. This is totally like S1 star, S1 star star, right? Like you go gradually. And surely you shrug your shoulders. At each step, you want to put that identity sign between those states, right? It's like Mark clips one nail, it's still Mark. Mark clips another nail, it's still Mark. And that, little changes. And then you could keep on clipping nails until you know, in my case, I mean, at one point, this is where you might want to think that, do you remember Van Inwagen's view of Van Inwagen on composition? What are the two sorts of things that exist in the world according to Van Inwagen? What are the two things that actually in his ontology compose? Like, there's only, actually, strictly speaking, there's simples, and there's only one thing that composes. Simples and living entities, exactly. Like, one of the things that you might want to keep in the back of your mind, I said that a lot of this connects and does a lot of lifting in other debates, is that, remember that view for a moment, right? When that was presented to you, you probably thought that was surprising, at any rate, probably crazy at first. But when you think about it, one of the reasons why you might want to think that that view wasn't so crazy is, if there's not a single cell that's the same as your 7-year-old version of yourself, then there's only a continuity, not of matter, but of form. And if there's a continuity of form between you, let's say your DNA keeps replicating itself, that's where the continuity of form comes in. Each time there's a new plank of your ship or a new cell that's generated, it's generated according to a certain blueprint, and they keep passing on the instructions and the means of replicating it, then you can see how that view is not completely nuts. That's what connects you to the 7-year-old version of yourself, is that you do compose, and there's some sense to the idea that living entities, because they replicate their form, they replicate their structure while changing the matter, are unique in that sense. Everybody else, does that make some sense? I'm making some big connections here. I don't want to stray off topic, but bringing together stuff from last time makes sense, type and clear. And if you got a comment or question, go ahead and type that. Van Inwagen's view that there are only simples and living entities, the only things that really compose are living things, is because I was thinking about this when I was talking about clipping my nails. Yeah. And Jaden says my microphone's cutting out. Sometimes that has to do with people typing. Can you folks hear me well? Is anybody? If my microphone is clear, type in clear. If it's blocking out, say block. Clear or block. It's just a little poll with everyone. Cool. All right. Yeah, and so this is one of the things I have to refrain from talking while people are typing, because I know for a fact that tends to affect it. All right, so this view is endurantism. Let's kind of zoom out and see it at a glance. This is endurantism. So one view down, two more to go. Let's look at another view now. This one's a little, I think that endurantism is, arguably, you could almost call it the common sense view. Now, perdurantism is where, if you've done metaphysics now, you might want to say, oh, I want a more sophisticated view because the other one runs into problems. Perdurantism, and it's an ugly word, and that's great because that means no one knows it, no one's used it before, it doesn't come with any baggage, is the view that objects persist over time by being spread out or extended over it. The perdurantist believes that in addition to having spatial parts, material objects also have temporal parts. Actually, stages is going to be another view, so it's really confusing to put that there. Material objects are four-dimensional in the sense that they are spread out in time in the same way that they're spread out in space. Just as material objects have different parts at different places, left halves and right halves, arms and legs, they have different parts at different times. First halves and last halves, childhoods and golden years. According to the perdurantist, objects like persons or lumps of clay persist over time by having parts at distinct times. This is basically, in a nutshell, the view. If the perdurantist is correct, then we should not view lumps history in the way that the enduritist recommended on the last page, but instead as it is depicted below. So notice the little umbrella expression at the top there, lump. Earlier, right, lump was here and lump was there and lump was here and lump was there, and we had this identity relation between the two. That was endurantism. Here, lump is the totality spread out through time of this, what we're looking at, the form and the matter together, right? You might also call this a four-dimensional worm. We're going to call this the worm view, right? So you can imagine if you were to do time slices, right? Actually, we're going to be slicing it for the next one, so don't slice it, but view it as a continuity. You, right, and your 7-year-old self are parts of this bigger thing, which is this spatial temporal 4-dimensional worm, right? Spreading itself out, presumably in something like an Einsteinian block universe, right? And the 7-year-old version is not a different person. It's a part of the same thing, and you are a part of the same thing. Just like lump right now is this one thing spreading over time, T0, T1, T2, T3, and all the way to the tip, whatever would be at the end, T5, right? Lump's the whole thing. And what you have are parts. So for the perjurantist, what exists at time T0, so if you look there, is not identical to what exists at a later time. So look, there's the non-identity sign between lump at T0 and lump at T1. Whereas here, remember, we had identity relations between each. Look at the equal sign. And here we have non-identity relations between each. For what exists at time T0 is only one temporal part of lump. What exists at T1 is a later temporal part of lump. It's not the same part as that which existed at time T0, and so on. The temporal parts of lump are no more numerically identical than your right arm is identical to your left arm. That's the view. And that's a really neat view, right? We're going to do more washes on this one because this one's, I think if the other one was common sense, this one's kind of taking you, I would imagine it's coming from a different place, a little more surprising. But as far as a first approximation goes, is that clear, everyone? Or if you have a question, ask your question. So we're going to zoom in. We're going to keep talking about this view for a little while. But if at least this particular first wash is clear, type in clear. If you've got a question, ask your question. Like my foot and my hand are not identical, and it doesn't bother me. No, it's not similar to Heraclitus. It is the similarities in this, right? So Heraclitus, if anyone remembers, this is a pre-Socratic philosopher known for saying, for instance, that everything is in perpetual change, such that you can't step into the same river twice. For Heraclitus, there's a real commitment there to everything being different all the time. We can say that lump is persisting through time here. Right? If you look at T3 and T0 and you ask yourself, for the perjurantist, is this the same thing? The thing shown at T3 and the thing shown at T0, is it part of the same thing? It's not the same thing, but it's part of the same thing. So there does seem to be something like persistence through time. You see that? And Heraclitus would not grant that. Jaden, does that make sense? For Heraclitus, he wouldn't have anything remote persistence through time. Whereas here's the way of trying to get the persistence. Yeah. So Heraclitus' answer is really easy. Get over it. You're not your 7-year-old self. And in fact, you're not even the next minute self, right? You're always going to be a different self. And that would be Heraclitus' solution. The perjurantist is going to say, no, you're a space-time worm. And the image of the worm, I hope, I mean, again, I wish I could, I might just pause for a second and draw this, because I feel like visually I probably don't have the resources to show this as clearly as I want. Here's what I mean by space-time worm. I'm just going to draw one because it's kind of annoying me that I can't draw on my thing. Like, you can imagine this is you. You're a space-time worm. Anybody into Dune lately? All right, you're like a sandworm. All right, this is your birth here. That's the tip. That's the birth. And what should I put at the other end here when it's going to twiddle out? What should I put? That's your death. Yeah, that's your death. Let's put your death there. I'm going to agree with death, right? I mean, certainly you're not going to replicate in the manner that we discussed a moment ago when we talked about DNA and so on. And you can imagine this being in 3D, right? This is your space-time worm, right? 4 dimensions. You can imagine you've got 3 dimensions. You extend, you got, X, Y, Z axis, but you also in time. So this is, the 7-year-old version of yourself. And this is, let's say, the 27-year-old version of yourself over here. Oh my, this is so difficult for the computer to do. It seems to be struggling so much, right? And the real you, I'm sorry to tell you, is you're a sandworm. This is you. I don't know if that's good news or bad news, Folks, is this good news or bad news? If you today you walked out and you learned you were a worm, you find that reassuring or disturbing? Type in reassuring if you feel this is reassuring, and disturbing if you feel this is more, I don't know, like overall more disturbing. I'm curious to see what folks think. I don't know why it would be disturbing. It's certainly surprising. I would agree. We can agree on that. But at any rate, like the idea is this, right? So there are things that can be said about the 7-year-old self that can't be said about the 20-several-year-old self and vice versa. So here's the thing, right? So like right now, you can drive a car. So let's say I'm going to take Amran, lowercase a. Amran can drive a car. So remember, it's a particular we care which. That's A. And I've got capital C, can drive a car. Amran, let me check in with you. Could you drive a car at 7-year-old when you were 7 years old? All right, cool. I pretty much assumed that was true, but you never know. You want to check in for that stuff. So it is true to say, right, that Amran at 7 was unable to drive a car. So now there's a predicate, right, that we can say about Amran at 27. It doesn't matter if I get the age right or wrong here. By Leibniz's law, should we say that these things are identical or non-identical? In virtue of Leibniz's law, should we say identical or non-identical? Remember, Leibniz's law says if you got at least one predicate that's different, one attribute that you can say for one but not of the other, they're not identical, right? And so that seems like that caused a lot of problem, because then you were like, oh my God, I'm not my 7-year-old self. And in fact, the disturbing part was to find out that none of your biological cells were still around. But if you're a space-time worm, if you're a 4-dimensional worm, none of that ought to bother you. Go by analogy with parts and wholes here for just a second. Right? Suppose I have a person over here. Let me draw a body. Right, here's a person, and here's their belly. I'm gonna put a belly button over here. That's their belly button. Looks like a little person, I suppose, but this is like the weirdest person, unless this looks like a petroglyph in some weird cave or something. Maybe they don't look too happy. And this is their belly button. These are their nipples. Here you go. What about this here? Let's say they drank a lot of beer. We can say about this that this thing here is soft, right? X is soft here. It's no problem saying that this is soft, because when you press down on it, it's nice and squishy, right? What about the kneecap? When I press down on the kneecap, is it soft? Yes or no? Let's go for the kneecap here. Nice big ball of bone. No, it's not soft. It's not soft. Actually, it's hard, right? So it's not soft. All right, cool. Let's call this Y, because it's another part, right? But we don't have any problems here. There's no tension whatsoever. None of us lose any sleep over this, right? Because of course, different parts can have different attributes. Like there's no problem there. We don't have a problem with understanding. I mean, let me just put an X again, right? And again, I'm not quantifying over this, but I don't need too much logical apparatus for this. We don't lose any sleep over the fact that these are not going to be identical, because you can say something truthfully of one and not of the other, right? And the idea is you want to exploit that analogy and then just generalize it to temporal parts. And if you go for temporal parts, what you end up with is this. My friends, is this detour into a drawing helpful? Type in helpful if that was helpful. Question if you have a question. I was kind of annoyed there. Yeah, so I'll get to your question, Michael. I'm just going to check in with folks. Okay, cool. And it was really painful for me to draw this software is so bric-a-brac. So Ney states, Michael says, that to be a material object is at least an empirical matter. Where do we locate the worm? Like this is the thing, right? So that's an interesting question and has to do with composition, right? So the idea is you can imagine, let's say there's a boundary around you, boundary conditions, right? So Michael, I don't think I have a hard time knowing air around you and your skin begins and ends. Would you agree? Let's take that as a dumb empirical standard. Would you think that's fine? Like there's the air around you and then there's you, or the parts you feel. Yeah. And so you make up some boundary, and then I get to slice, it looks like a fillet, like a pork fillet, right? I get to fillet you through this four-dimensional space-time. But you touch other stuff as well, right? It's not like, the three axes of the three dimensions, up, down, left, right, the whole thing, there's a boundary there, but there's the parts that you replicate, and there's the parts you don't. If nothing else, that could be a criteria. Like the DNA will replicate certain cells, but your DNA is not actively replicating the air around you, but it is replicating the cells around you, right? So you make boundary conditions for that. But at any rate, even if you, so when you lose the old skin, flutters away, right? But there's again, who cares, right? As an abstraction, I think we can all wrap our mind around this thing. And then you'd be like, let's say the world was a big piece of Jello, right? And you had this big worm inside the Jello that was different colored, and that would be just enough for you to sort of sort out where the worm is. I'm going to check in with everyone. Remember, this is the axis of time here. Does everyone see this four-dimensional stuff? This is time, right? And this is you at any particular part. So this is a part. Type in yes if everyone can see that. And again, we really want to make sure these drawings do work for us. Otherwise, it'd be like, what's going on, right? Yeah. Let me just check in again with you. As you get accustomed, actually, I'll check in with you later, but put that on the shelf. My sense is, at first, the perdurantist view is always surprising, but the longer you spend time with it, it's like a Doc Martens boot or something. It becomes comfortable, like you'll settle into it. So here we have, so you see you're non-identical. That's what I meant earlier when I said, when you press on the belly, it's soft, but when you press on the kneecap, it's hard, right? There's no problem there. Look at lump at time t0. That's like your soft belly. That's like your beer gut. And look at Goliath at time t3. That's like your hard kneecap. And yeah, they're not the same, but who cares? They're different parts of lump. Where's lump? Lump's the whole thing over an axis of time. And so let's keep reading about this. Perdurantism has become increasingly influential since Quine's presentation of the position in his paper Identity, Ostension, and Hypostasis. Man, Quine was quite the person, I have to say. Perdurantist believes that just as people and other material objects have spatial parts, are spread out over different places, we should view them too as having temporal parts, as being spread out over different times. For the perdurantist, this is just like as if one hid behind a curtain, first poking out a hand, then a leg, then one's head. We would say at each time that it was the same person that appeared momentarily from behind the curtain, even though, in another sense, all that was revealed each time was a part. Perdurantism is often defended for its ability to help us find solutions to the puzzles of material constitution. Consider once again the ship of Theseus. Earlier, we were tacitly assuming endurantism, it turns out. The question was framed as a question about which object at a later time, S2 or S3, was identical to the original ship, S1. And this assumed that if the ship of Theseus was to persist, in a neutral sense of, tying the beginning and the end, then it must be identical to one of these objects at a later time, S2 or S3. However, we may now see that if we're perdurantists, we don't think that the ship persists over time by there being a later object that is strictly identical to that earlier existing object, S1. Instead, we will think that the ship persists by having numerically distinct temporal parts at different times. So let me say that again. If we're perdurantists, we don't think that the ship persists over time by there being a later object that is strictly identical to that earlier existing object S1. Instead, we will think that the ship persists by having numerically distinct temporal parts at different times. And so when we ask about S1, S2, and S3, the perdurantist will say that none of these objects is identical to any of the others. Rather, these are three numerically distinct temporal parts. What is happening, according to the perdurantist, is that the two ships temporarily overlap. They share a common temporal part. And the simple reason the perdurantist doesn't find this problematic is that it is very similar to other cases that we don't find at all problematic, cases of spatial overlap. We have no problem understanding how two objects may share a common spatial part at a time. My body and my left arm share my common spatial parts, including my left hand and my left wrist. Or when two roads intersect, they share a common part. Sometimes two roads will overlap for an extended stretch. In that stretch, one may truly say that one is traveling simultaneously on two highways, both the I-95 and the I-87, let's say. Most people find nothing puzzling about this. Once you press the analogy between space and time in the same way that the perjurantist wants to, then temporal overlap, the sharing of temporal parts, seems to be no more problematic than spatial overlap, the sharing of spatial parts. There are indeed two ships present at S1, according to the perjurantist, but these need not look any more like there are two ships than they need look like there are two roads present at a place where two roads overlap for a certain stretch. Again, let me go back to drawings now because I feel like that's really needed now. Right, so let's go back to our worms here. If you've got the perjurantist view of these space-time worms, this four-dimensional worm, this is how you view the earlier situation with the ship of Theseus. Here's one worm. And I'm going to use another color here. Here's another worm. Actually, I'll try to draw that better. I want it to overlap a bit more. There you go. Here's another worm. There you go. And then you go ahead and let's populate that with the stuff that it is. Let's write down S1, S2, so S1. Man, this thing is struggling. S3 and S2. This was the terminology that we used before, but actually we see that there was no S1. All along it was S3, and all along it was S2, but they shared a part of the road together for a while, and then they split. My friends, is this clear? As simplistic as this diagram is, can you see it? Can you see the work that it's doing for us? Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. Space-time worms. I love the worm as an expression. I feel like it just captures, and this is becoming attractive now because look, if we were stuck with some of these issues, then we're like, yeah, there you go. That's doing some work for us. And it's always cool to see actual progress being made on these issues, even if the progress, we're going to turn around, of course, and drive a sledgehammer through all this as much as we can, right? But that's it. So similarly, the perjurantist will consider both Lump and Goliath to be objects that are extended over space and time. And although these objects, excuse me, temporarily overlap for some of their histories, they share some stages in common. They do not overlap for their entire histories. All right. I'm thinking, you know what? I was going to do the cool videos now, but I'm going to push forward to another view, and then we'll do the cool videos. Then we'll do the cool videos. Let's do this first here. I'm going to scroll down and teach you exdurantism, and then we'll go for the videos. You're still hanging in there with me? I'm looking at the time, and I'm trying to make this as clear as possible. Everyone, how's your energy level? 10 is you're super sharp. 0, you're a vegetable. Where are you at? I'm going to say I'm at 9. I'll put that in the chat. I'm hanging in there. Coffee's working good. Oh, that's winding down. Got to make sure. Yeah, I know, Kelly. I'm so sorry about that. So that's a 5 for you. All right. Well, let's hang in there. Exdurantism, very quickly. So as we saw the perjurantist, this is our problems that I'm skipping over that we might see after. Has some problems. Exdurantism is going to now have a slightly different view. So exdurantism, this is another ugly word. This is exdurantism. It's not so much that you have a space-time worm, is that there are these slices, what we're going to call stages, right? And so if you imagine, this is David Lewis, he's a metaphysician, right? At time T1, he's standing up, and at time T2, he's sitting down, so he's not standing up. So, by Leibniz's law, we'd have to say that these are two different things. It's kind of, imagine like spatial temporal worms, but in slices, right? By the way, does anyone know the distinction, if you've ever gone to the butcher, between a steak and a fillet? Type in yes if you know that, no if you don't. Like when you go to the butcher, steak and fillet, You know those words? Yep. Amran, okay, so here's, I'm going to teach you. If you have a fillet, so this would be a fillet. So next time you go and you eat I don't know, a fillet of let's say salmon, a salmon fillet. It's cutting along the length, and Kelly, you can spot me here and verify me if I get this right. It's cutting along the length of the muscle fibers, right? So if you take a fillet knife, what you do is you run it along the length of the muscle fibers. Kelly, help me out, and someone else. That's a filleting. What's a steak? Like, think of a T-bone. What's a steak? So this goes along the length of the muscle fibers. You're filleting it. What would be steaks? Like, think of a salmon steak or a T-bone steak. Even if you eat them or don't eat them, I'm sure you can visualize what those look like. Mm-hmm. Across the grain. So you cut against the grain like this. So if you have a fillet, a salmon fillet, it typically will look like this. Yeah. Right? Like, has anyone ever seen this, like a steak, a salmon fillet? Like, even if you don't buy it, because it's typically in these days ridiculously expensive, a salmon steak, like, it looks like this. You can see that's all the meat, and you had the spine over here. It was gutted, right? And you can think of one way of thinking of the distinction between perdurantism and exdurantism. Perdurantism is the fillet view. So let me say that again slowly. Perdurantism is the fillet view, and exdurantism is the steak view. So what it says is there are these super thin steaks that are a moment thick, a moment thick, a moment thick, and it's going to call them stages, 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 stages. And those steaks, super thin, bear causal and resemblance relations to one another, but they're, strictly speaking, each one is a different thing. They're not apart, they're different things, and they bear another kind of relation. Is that distinction making some help? Can you see that distinction a bit? Fillet is for the perdurantism, and exdurantism is the slices. Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. And again, I'm doing backflips to try to make this as clear as possible. So we're back in our reading here, right? And this would look, so Jaden, nice segue. This would look like Heraclitus. Yes, thank you. That I should have thought that myself. That's a beautiful loose end that we can tie up. So Heraclitus would be an exdurantist. Do you see that, Jaden? Is that helpful? Do you have the resources now to make sense of that? He'd be an exdurantist. Yes. All right. Cool. And so that's nice, by the way, Jaden. Good catch. Good catch. So the perdurantists and endurantists both believe in all of the same entities and agree about which entities are temporal or spatial parts of which others. The difference between the two views is that, whereas the perdurantist thinks that objects are temporally extended objects possessing temporal parts, right? The exdurantist thinks they're all temporary stages. And now I'm going to go to my video, right? Because I'm going to ask you, and keep this in the back of your mind as a kind of as a fun question. Are we looking at a fillet or steak view here? We're going to have some more fun with YouTube and relax by watching another mind-blowing video. Type in, press on this, and then and tell me if that opened up. Once you've opened up, tell me yes. I'm also going to open it up and watch it with you. I'll check in with everyone. And once again, I'm going to put everything on pause. Enjoy the clip. Watch the whole clip. Spoiler alert, by the way, this is a clip from a movie called Interstellar. If I'm going to be ruining the movie for you. All right. So just so you know, part of what we do here. All right. So have fun. Watch that clip and then type in back when you're back in class. I'm going to put everything on pause. I'm also going to enjoy it and watch. My friends, I'm going to give you another video to watch. Click on that and type in yes when it's opened up. And same idea, type in back when you're back, and then we'll talk about it. So I'm not assuming anyone's watched the movie, so there's not enough information in that first clip. So, and either way, it's really enjoyable to watch this. Watch the second one, and then we'll touch base again. All right, so same thing. I'm putting myself on pause, and we'll reconvene, and then we'll talk about it. My friends, before I ask you so Jaden says I'm embarrassed. I haven't seen that movie. Yo, you have to watch this. Holy cow! This was Interstellar by Christopher Nolan. Before I ask you the geeky question, how was that? Does this course help to shed light on that moment? It's one of my favorite movies. I guess this is you don't see that every day. Like someone able to he's navigating the room at its time moments, right? Best Nolan film in my opinion. He's got quite a few, right? There's we mustn't forget the Inception. All right, so here's the geeky question now. What do you think is happening in Inception? Exurantism or perjurantism? That's a geeky question now. Are we looking at steaks or fillets? I don't know. We're definitely the cool thing is even if we're not clear on that, I think we might be looking at exurantism because they seem to be distinct rooms, at least as they're represented in this what they call a tesseract, this whatever this is, right? This space that they've created for the character to be navigating, all four dimensions. But at any rate, it's definitely four dimensional, right? So the when he's touching the watch, he's touching the worm of the watch. Does anyone see that? Type in clear if that's clear. He was touching the worm of the watch. At all times, the worm is. Type in clear if that's clear. Now we have the resources to make sense of that. That's the worm. It's the watch through time. You can kind of see it bleed, right? And so this is. I think this is a nice. You can't ask for much better, right? Um, let's look now at what might one say against this. So remember, we started endurantism looked like the common sense view, and then perdurantism solves some of the problems associated with it, and exdurantism kind of solves other problems. And unfortunately, like there's so much to cover, can't go into all the nitty gritty. But like, what would be some drawbacks to four dimensionalism? And by four dimensionalism, I'll mean everything encompassing both perdurantism and exdurantism. Let's read that, and then we'll slowly wrap up to our summary. So endurantism is typically combined with a related position about material objects, three-dimensionalism. This is the view that denies any objects have temporal parts in addition to spatial parts. The view is called three-dimensionalism because it views material objects as having extension in just three spatial dimensions: height, width, and depth. Objects also exist and persist through time, of course, but the three-dimensionalist does not view this persistence as a way of being extended or spread out over time. Rather, objects are only spread out over space. All of their material parts are spatial parts. By contrast, perdurantists, all of them, will reject three-dimensionalism in favor of four-dimensionalism. We've considered the case in favor of the two four-dimensionalist views, but is there anything that can be said for endurantism in its defense? Endurantism is frequently characterized as the common sense view of the nature of persistence. Before we think too hard about the puzzles of material constitution, about Leibniz's law and temporary intrinsics, this view may certainly seem plausible, that the me that exists now, just at this time right here, is the same as, and strictly numerically identical to, the me that existed yesterday and the day before. Many philosophers will concede that the common sense counts for something in metaphysics. What we'll examine here is whether there's anything more to be said in defense of endurantism. Now, some metaphysicians deny that it makes sense to think of material objects as possessing temporal parts. To one seeing this debate for the first time, one might be confused. How could this be? Isn't the analogy with spatial parts sufficient to make this clear? How could the philosophers not be understanding? The conceptual problems for people like David Wiggins isn't understanding the notion of a temporal part per se. Rather, Wiggins insists that four-dimensionalism is confused since it's not even an answer to the question that we're interested in about how objects persist over time. His argument is instead that since a physical object has spatial parts, to find the whole object, you need to only explore its boundaries at a time. We can imagine examining, say, Justin Trudeau. So I grab him and I ask, what are his boundaries? And that's the kind of question that came up earlier when we were talking about the surface of the skin and the air and so on. And surely whatever is the answer to that, once we grasp where Trudeau ends and let's say air begins, we've located this object's boundaries, even though we've only examined it at one time. This is Huygens' point. If an object's boundaries can be discerned at one time, then it cannot be an object extended in time, for then it would have more parts and a boundary that no one can see. So the idea is I grab some object. You say, here's this object, where is it? And then it's like, oh, here it is, and I've grabbed it, and I've delineated it. I know where it is, where it begins and ends, and I know its boundaries. I don't need to do that over time. And it seems like once I've done that, I'm done. Like, where's the Xander right now? And I grab Xander, and there Xander is. It's like done. There's not more for me to do. And if there's not more for me to do, then it seems that I can do that in a moment. And if that's the case, then it's just confused to think about parts extending in time. And moreover, it's not so much an answer to the question, it's dodging it, because it's a static thing. Your worm, it's just permanent, right? It's not moving, right? So let me go back to the drawing that I had, and I think we'll end on that as just to understand the criticism. Like if you look at you, this was good old you. Now you've just learned you're probably a worm. This worm, it's not moving. It's static. Your perception might be moving along this, right? So as you move along time on this axis T, right? Maybe you're kind of like the striptease and seeing one part and another. Maybe that's moving, but the worm itself is not moving. Likewise, if you treat it like the exgerentist would, as a series of CD-ROM that are just like, CDs or DVDs that are kind of stacked together, so it's the stake view, right? If you gloss it in the manner that the exgerentist, does, you have a bunch of CDs that are stacked and they're a moment thick, that's also not moving. Now, the benefit of the exgerentist is if you grab one moment, and that's you, and I say, where are you? I've got you entirely located. So it's not as susceptible, this four-dimensionalist view called exgerentism is not susceptible to the criticism that once I've located my boundaries, I've got you, because I do got you, right? I've got the whole of you, but you're just this one slice, this one CD-ROM. But it's also static. It's not really talking about change. It's not really talking about enduring through time in the manner that we set out to establish at the beginning. We were puzzled about the puzzles pertaining to persistence. And the argument here against four-dimensionalist view is that it doesn't actually answer that question. It answers it by basically putting everything into a static sort of mode and redefining the terms so drastically that really we haven't answered the problem. And really what we want to know is, how did something endure through time? Cool. All right. So let's recap. So we did a lot of work. I promised you we'd have a lot on our plate today. Let's do, and as I said, we a recap here, right? Let's do a recap of everything that we've looked at so far. All right. And again, my computer is really struggling because I did stuff. You should never do stuff. You can break down the views that we've looked at into three-dimensionalist views and four-dimensional views, right? So three-dimensionalism and four-dimensionalism. In three-dimensionalism, you can think of endurantism of matter. I'm going to sub-distinguish endurantism using the matter-form distinction. This is where you're tracking the stuff that stays common from lump to statue. So the stuff from original ship to rotten reassembly, right? So whatever is the stuff and in that case, if you have endurantism of matter, then, if you've changed all the planks, it's now a different thing. You can also think of endurantism of form. So again, using that distinction, where we're tracking the rearrangements, that's the arrangements that stay common from original ship to new ship, from young living body to old living body. So just these sub-distinctions, right? Four-dimensionalist views, we saw perdurantism, where parts of a spatio-temporal worm can have contradictory properties, but where only a part of the worm is there at any instant. So it's not a problem if there are contradictory properties, like a soft belly and a hard knee, no problem there, right? And then finally, exgerentism, which meets the criticism that actually when you grab a hold of it, you've got the whole thing, but only at the cost of saying that the whole thing is there in an instant. But it seems to give up on persistent with its collection of stages that are related by either similarity or causality. And these are the four views that we have. My friends, of these four views that I've tried to give enough love to, which one would you say is the the least clear as far as you're concerned, that you still can't wrap your mind around? The one that you'd have to work more to sort of meditate on and think about, and you can't quite see its arguments and motivations yet. I didn't give a lot of love to exurantism, but the four-dimensional views in general. See what people have to say. And again, all of that's going to shimmy into place as you keep, your decades. Put in those decades. Exurantism. The fourth, the exurantism, yeah. Yeah. Adding the space factor. Exurantism will take a while to wrap up. Yeah, it's an interesting view. And I mean, there's good things to be said for it. And so the idea is, what are the pros and cons? And again, don't be too concerned about planting your flag. Really try to be concerned with what are the arguments for and against, and what are the considerations. What do I want now from you? Well, you need to submit an entry on today. We had 2 little bursts, but other than that, I think things were pretty cool. We had our cool videos. How was today's class, by the way? Was it fun? Scale of 1 to 10. How fun was this? I was kind of pissed because when I was drawing, it was getting 10. I love it too. I'm going to give it a 10. I'm biased, but I really love this subject. Yeah, and it's really messed up. It's really messed up. There's more than the chapter. As I said, there's more in the chapter. I'm going to hold you accountable only for the stuff that we've looked at. So there's plenty on the plate there. There's more there. But go ahead and have fun with that. For the midterm, I'm not holding you